Hello everyone, my name is Hannah and today I have some book recommendations for you. So it's actually been a really long time since I have recommended any books actually, mostly because it's been a really long time since I've read a lot of books that I've felt like recommending, but recently I read two really great books that I really loved and it kind of inspired me to talk about them since that's what I used to always do on my channel. So today I have a list of 7 books that I think you need to read because I think they're exceptional and I think they're the type of thing that pretty much anyone could enjoy, and I think more people just should read them. Some of them are very popular books, some of them are lesser known books, some of them I've talked about a lot, some of them I don't think I've ever talked about before. And I have a pretty good mix of different genres and categories. I have like a classic and some romance and some fantasy, so I think there's a little bit of something for everyone. But yeah, without any further ado, here are 7 books that I think you need to read. So first up on my list is a book that I've mentioned a couple of times in recent videos, but I do want to mention it again because I just want it to be in one of these videos, because if you haven't read this yet, I really think you should, because it's honestly that good and it's that worth the hype. And that is Red, White, and Royal Blue by Casey mcquiston. Red, White, and Royal Blue is a new adult romance novel that follows the fictional, obviously, story of the son of the President of the United States and the Prince of England. And the two of them fall in love with each other and then have a relationship, which clearly comes with a lot of problems, as you can imagine, but it's fantastic. I absolutely adored this book. I've talked about it many times, like I mentioned. I listened to this on an audiobook with my friend while we were driving on a road trip, and it was such a fun reading experience, and it was such a good story. My favorite thing about this is that it genuinely feels like a rom-com in book form, which is what I want out of any romance that I read. But also, it's genuinely funny and genuinely heartfelt. I didn't think I would like this as much as I ended up liking it, because I thought that it would be more funny and less serious than it ended up being, but it was actually pretty serious, but also lighthearted enough that it wasn't too heavy, and that's what I love so much about it. It has such a perfect balance of humor and romance and touching on serious topics and politics, and that combination being so well balanced makes it such an enjoyable book to read. It's really quick to get through, it's addicting, and it's just so enjoyable. So I highly recommend trying this book out. The concept alone is just so fun and so out there, and I think it's definitely the type of book that you will enjoy if you're looking for romance, if you're looking for something to make you laugh, if you're looking for something to make you cry. This has pretty much anything you could want in a good fictional story. So yeah, highly recommend checking this one out if you haven't already. Again, I know it's super popular, but if you haven't read it yet, it's worth the hype. The next book on my list is actually a classic, and this is probably what I would consider my favorite classic that I've read, and that is Rebecca by Daphne du Maurier. I know that this recently had a movie come out on Netflix, I believe. I haven't watched that yet, but I'm not really sure if that's any good. The book, however, is phenomenal. It follows the story of this young girl who's about in her 20s, and she meets this man who's significantly older than her, I think in his 40s or so, and they end up getting married, and she moves in with him, only to find out that the house that she's now moved into, his house, is kind of haunted by the ghost of his first wife, his late wife, whose name was Rebecca. And the main character actually does not have a name. We never find out what her name is, and that's one of my favorite things about this book. It's really a story about identity and kind of figuring out who you are, which is why making the main character nameless is genius. It's really such a good story. I truly recommend this if you are not into classics, if you don't really like reading classics, but you kind of want to try out some classics. I highly recommend this one. Since this was written in the 40s or late 30s, I believe, I think that it's a lot more accessible than some of the earlier classics. If you're not into reading Austen or Bronte or anything like that, I definitely recommend giving this one a try. It's a mystery, a bit of a ghost story, a little bit of a coming of age story as well. It kind of has everything in it. It's definitely very haunting, and the imagery in here is really vivid, and that's one of the things I really like about it. It's very much a sensory experience while you're reading this book. I felt like I could imagine everything as I was reading it, and that's why even though I read this several years ago, it's still very vivid in my head because I remember it so clearly. I love the writing in here as well. It's not overly flowery, it's very concise, which I actually like both flowery and concise writing, but I feel like for the story that this is trying to tell, the way that it's written is absolutely perfect. So I highly recommend trying out Rebecca. Again, I haven't seen the movie, so I'm not sure if the new movie is any good, but I definitely do recommend that you try out reading the book because the book is absolutely worth worth your time. Next, I have a lesser known novel by one of my favorite authors, and I talk about her other books all the time, like they're some of my all-time favorite books, but I don't talk about this one as much, and this is definitely on my list of favorite books by her, definitely one of my favorite books, but I just never talk about it very much, so I felt like it was a good time to mention it here, and that is After I Do by Taylor Jenkins Reid. So Taylor Jenkins Reid, as most of you probably know, is the author of Daisy Jones and the Six and The Seven Husbands of Evelyn Hugo, which are two of my favorite books of all time. I love those books with my whole heart. I talk about them endlessly because they're so good. And when I first read Evelyn Hugo, since that one came out before Daisy Jones, I liked it so much that I was like, I need to read everything else by Taylor Jenkins Reid. So I did. And I have literally read her entire backlist. And of all of those books, of course, Daisy Jones and Evelyn Hugo are my favorites. But my next favorite, which actually comes not super close to them because those are like my god tier books. What comes pretty close though is After I Do, because this book is so phenomenal. After I Do is about this couple who gets married and then ends up taking a break from their marriage for about a year and then lives their lives separately. They feel like their marriage is about to fall apart, so they come up with a plan to basically break up for a year and live their lives independently to see how they feel about each other when they come back together. And I don't know how to tell you like how often I think about this book. Like, I know I don't talk about it very often, but I think about this a lot because it was really touching, and I feel like this book is evidence of how good of a writer and storyteller Taylor Jenkins Reid really is. Because we talk about Evelyn Hugo and Daisy Jones and the Six, and just the concept of those books alone are just so out there and like larger than life, which makes them so much fun to read because they're about these like fictional celebrities. But this is just a quiet little story about some random couple who's having marital problems, and I don't know how to explain to you how touching this was. Can I relate? No, I've never been married, nor have I ever gone through marital problems, but something about the way that she wrote these characters and their humanity and the feelings and experiences that they are going through was just so raw and honest that I felt like I was going through this breakup with them. I felt like I was having my year-long self-discovery journey, spending time away from the person that I had put my everything into, and I felt like I was trying to find myself along with these characters. And I just think that when an author can take you outside of your own experience and put you into an experience that you've never gone through before, but still make you feel all of those emotions, then you know they're really good. And that's how I feel about this book. I feel like this is one of those, just like I mentioned, quiet stories that just kind of hides under the radar, but it definitely deserves more attention because this is one of her best books. It's about finding what you really love, finding yourself, what you value when you're on your own. And I feel like that alone is something that almost everyone can relate to, even if you haven't experienced anything else in this story, any of the things the characters go through. Just the themes alone, I feel like, are universal experiences, which again makes it so relatable. Yeah, I just think that it's absolutely worth your time. If you've wanted to give another Taylor Jenkins Reid book a chance, if you've read Daisy Jones and Evelyn Hugo, I highly recommend you try this one. Read all of her books. I love all of them, but this is hands down my favorite one of her other books. It's so good. And again, so worth the read. All right, the next book on my list is a book that I recently just finished reading, and I absolutely adored this book, and that is This Is How You Lose the Time War. This Is How You Lose the Time War is a sci-fi novella. It's a novel novella. It's kind of shorter. It's not very long at all, and which is my actually only complaint about it. My only complaint about this book is that I wish it was longer so we'd had more time to develop everything, but besides that, it's pretty perfect. The story is about two time travelers who are on opposite sides of a time war, and they end up falling in love with one another, and then they write letters to each other through time expressing their love for one another, and oh my god, it's so good. First of all, anything that has to do with time travel is definitely the type of thing that I will want to read because I love time travel stories and I always have. So that sounded fascinating to me. And also like being on opposite sides of a war and like writing letters to each other through time. The concept alone of this, I was just like, I'm gonna love this. And I'm so glad I wasn't wrong. One of the things that I really liked about this besides the concept alone was the way that it was written. As you all know, I like anything that's really magical, fantastical, whimsical, and kind of just doesn't make logical sense. Like I love magical realism and I like books like Ocean at the End of the Lane by Neil Gaiman, stuff like that, where you kind of just have to suspend your disbelief and kind of go with it. So if that's not your type of book, I honestly don't think you'll like this very much because that is what this book is. And if you're not like paying attention or if you're not into that type of storytelling, I don't think you'll have a great time reading this. But if you are, and if you want to try a book that is like that, I highly recommend trying this one out because It's so good. The romance in here is heart-wrenching. I actually felt something for once, for the first time in a long time. I feel like it takes a lot for me to feel anything when it comes to romance in books, which is why I don't actually read a lot of romance in general. But with this one, I definitely felt the romance. I was rooting for these two, for Blue and Red, because I just wanted them to be happy, even though like the odds were not in their favor. And it was also just so great to see like a queer love story like this in this type of like fantasy and sci-fi, because I feel like we don't have queer representation for women in fantasy that often. And seeing these two women like fighting through time for each other was so great. The writing in here is also beautiful. A lot of it is told in letters, but there's also like each character's perspective as well. So it's a good mix of like everything. And it was really poetic, and there were so many quotes and things I loved in it as well. Like everything about this was everything I love. So yeah, highly recommend checking this book out. If you want something that's short, this is definitely a good one. And if you want something that will tug at your heartstrings, and also if you want a book where the ending makes it even better, highly recommend this one. I feel like one of my favorite things is when a book has a really good, satisfying ending. And this is definitely one of those books for me. I feel like the ending bumped this book up so much for me. I loved the ending of it, and I felt like it made the whole story even better. So yeah, highly recommend this one as well. All right, next up on my list of recommendations is a book that I read years and years ago, and I feel like I used to recommend this all the time because it's genuinely one of my favorite YA contemporaries. I feel like it's just been so long since I've talked about it, and I was thinking about it recently, and I was like, I feel like I need to reread this, and I feel like I need to talk about it again because I forget how much I actually like this book because I genuinely love it so much. And that is, of course, The Sun Is Also a Star by Nicola Yoon. This is another book that had a movie come out kind of recently-ish, within the last couple of years, and I still haven't watched that movie, which I really need to do. I've been meaning to watch it since it came out. But The Sun Is Also a Star, like I mentioned, is one of my favorite YA contemporary novels. I think it is so good. It is one of the YA contemporaries that actually got me into reading more YA contemporary, because before this I really didn't read much at all. I did not like YA contemporary very much, only a select few books here and there. But after I read this, I was like, maybe I'm missing out on like a whole genre, and I was. So I definitely was way more open to reading more YA contemporary after this one because I liked it so much. But still, not that many books live up to this. This was so good. Again, this is a very popular book and it's been out for years and years, but that doesn't mean it's not worth recommending again for anyone who still hasn't read it. So if you don't know what it's about, The Sun Is Also a Star is told in two perspectives, that of Natasha and Daniel. Natasha is Jamaican American and her family is facing the threat of being deported, and Daniel is Korean American and he's kind of just dealing with his family's expectations of him. And the two end up meeting one day on the day that Natasha's family is supposed to be deported, and she's trying to do whatever it takes to prevent that from happening. And they basically end up spending this whole day together. And this book actually takes place over the span of one day, if I remember correctly. I'm pretty sure it's literally just one day. So it's kind of insta-love, but at the same time, I don't even care because the story is so well written and everything about the like themes of this are so well put together. Like, it's just so good. It's obviously about their relationship and their feelings that are developing for each other, but it's also about so much more. So much of this book is about identity, obviously, and they're two very different identities, but how they can also relate to one another. And it's about their different perspectives on life too. They have very different outlooks on the world, and seeing how they come together and seeing how each of them changes the other a little bit is just so beautiful. And that's what I like so much about it. The story has a lot of nuance, and I feel like you don't find that in a lot of YA contemporaries. I'm not saying that they're not good or that they're not complicated or not well written, because a lot of them definitely are, but there's something about this one. The nuance of this story, the way that she describes their identities, the way that she tackles these subjects with such like precision and detail that goes into so much more depth than I feel like you find in a lot of other stories that try and talk about identity, which feel very surface level to me. This one doesn't feel surface level. Nothing about The Sun Is Also a Star feels surface level, even though the premise of it seems kind of like out there and a little bit wild. It's one of my favorite fiction books that talks about identity and race and class and what it's like to live as an immigrant or the child of immigrants in the United States. Besides the fact that it talks about such important topics with so much grace, I feel like it's also just a fun story to read. And the romance in here I think is really great as well. I actually enjoy the romance. So yeah, highly recommend this one as well. Again, I know this is an older book that's been out for some time now and it's definitely popular, but if you haven't read it before, or if you have read it and you kind of just want to reread, pick this one up again, because I feel like it's the type of book that you could definitely reread and and get something new from. Next up on my list, we have another book that I've mentioned multiple times in recent videos, but I definitely wanted to recommend it here as well because this is a book that I just genuinely, like, I couldn't make this video if I didn't include this in here. Genuinely, I think everyone should read this. I don't think everyone will be in the place to read this necessarily because it's definitely a much heavier, darker book that's difficult to read, but if you can, I definitely think it's worth it, and that is none other than In the Dream House. I have talked about this book so many times, but I'm gonna keep talking about it until more people have read it because you should read it. It's so good. In the Dream House is actually a memoir, so this is the one nonfiction book I have on this list that is about Carmen Maria Machado's life in this one specific relationship that she was in with a woman, and it was a very abusive relationship, an emotionally abusive relationship. So like I mentioned, if that's not something you're comfortable reading about right now, definitely not necessarily the book for you right now, but if it is something that you can read at the moment, I highly recommend trying it out because, oh my god. I've mentioned multiple times as well that my favorite thing about this book is that while it is nonfiction and it is a memoir and it's a true story, the way that she writes this book feels like it is fictional. One, her writing is just phenomenal and she can make any prose feel like it's poetry. And two, she starts out this book with a prologue about archival violence, which, overly simplified, is basically just the way that historically people of color, queer people have been left out of the archives in history because those archives were typically written by straight white men. And she talks about the archive and archival violence and basically trying to reclaim her own archive, and not just reclaim it, but create her own, essentially, which I found fascinating. The prologue of this book is honestly one of my favorite parts of this book. I read the prologue and I was like, oh my god, I would do anything for Carmen Maria Machado. And she writes this entire story with that context in mind. So basically she is creating her own archive, doing that through the lens of creating a fiction for herself, if that makes sense. Like, the story of this is formatted like fiction, even though it is her reality. And it's just so phenomenally well done. Like, I don't know how else to describe it. I have not read anything like this before. And that's why I keep recommending it and why I want everyone to read it, because it's just some of the best writing I have ever seen. Apart from that, it's just so heartbreaking and honest and raw what she writes about in here, the relationship that she was in and how terrible and awful that it was, and the honesty within that as well I find really, really refreshing, especially because she's writing about a queer relationship and people don't often talk about how abuse isn't exclusive to heterosexual relationships or isn't exclusive to men being abusive towards women in a relationship. It can go any way, and she touches on that a lot, obviously, and I just respect her so much for the way that she told this story and how truthful it was. I, like I mentioned many, many times before, cannot recommend this book enough. If you want to read nonfiction, if you want something that's relatively short, if you want something with beautiful writing, if you want anything, honestly, except like maybe a good time, I'd highly recommend trying out In the Dream House because you will not be disappointed. And finally, we have reached the last book on my list, which is actually the last book I just finished reading. And oh my god, I don't even know what to say about this because I feel like this book got me out of a reading slump. I feel like I might actually be out of my reading slump because this was the fastest I have finished a book in months. In literally months. I finished it within the span of 24 hours, which is incredible for me at this point. Granted, it's very short, but that doesn't matter because I wanted to keep reading. Like, I just kept reading. I didn't want to put it down. I was up so late last night finishing this book because, oh my god, I love it. And that is none other than The House in the Cerulean Sea. I don't know if I've ever been so pleasantly surprised by a book. I genuinely thought that I would like this when I first heard about it and based on the people who recommended it to me, but I didn't think I would like it as much as I did because this was easily a 5-star book for me. Like, it was just so good. There was nothing to not like. If you don't know what this book is about, the best way that I can describe it is that it feels like a mix of a series of unfortunate events and what I wanted the Every Heart a Doorway series to feel like. It takes place in this like fantasy world where people can be born as like different fictional creatures, magical creatures or monsters. You can be born like a sprite or a pixie or a gnome or a shapeshifter, things like that. But it follows the story of this man who's basically a caseworker, and then he's assigned to go to this one specific orphanage that has some kids there who are considered very much outside of the norm even within this world. Like, all the people who are born as like a magical creature in this society are pretty much like ostracized and people are definitely prejudiced against them. But this specific orphanage has some kids who people have considered like especially dangerous because one of the kids who's there is like the son of Lucifer. So our main character has to go there to investigate this orphanage, and I don't even know what to tell you. This book is so delightful. It is so delightful. Like, this is like the epitome of heartwarming. It makes me so happy. It's so pure, but it's really deep at the same time, because obviously the metaphor of these people being born as part magical creature or monster and having to have like registration cards and being like prejudiced against by society who doesn't consider them to be normal. Like, clearly there's a very clear metaphor and theme going on throughout all of this. I love that aspect of it as well. So it's very deep and it means a lot, but it is also just so pure. Like, it's kind of a middle grade story, but it's also not exactly middle grade either. I kind of feel like you can't put it in a category. I'd actually categorize this as adult, but not really just for adults. Like, anyone of any age can read this book, truly. And I think it'll mean something to you at a different point in your life, which is another thing I really like about it. But it's truly just so beautiful. I love every single character. I feel like it's been so long since I've actually cared this much about new characters, not from a series I've already read or characters I already know. I had not felt this attached to new characters in so long, but oh my god, I love these kids so much. I love the main characters so much. I love everyone. And I truly feel like this has gotten me out of my reading slump, because now all I want to do is read. And it's actually what inspired me to make this video in the first place, because I finished that book and I was like, oh my god, I have to recommend it. What else can I recommend? So then I put it on this list and made this whole list of recommendations, because I think everyone should read The House in the Cerulean Sea, because it's so good. It is so good, and you will not be disappointed. Oh my god. It's whimsical, magical, heart-wrenching, has characters that you will absolutely grow to love and be attached to, and there's nothing more you could want. I cannot recommend it enough, and you should absolutely read it. And there you all have it. That is it for my list of 7 books that you need to read. Let me know in the comments down below if you have read any of the books that I mentioned in this video. What are your thoughts on them? And if you haven't read any of them, let me know which ones you now want to read. I'm very curious. If there are any other book recommendation videos that you would like to see, definitely let me know any of your ideas or suggestions down below. I'd love to make more book recommendation videos. I have a couple more planned, but if there's anything like specific, like if you want fantasy or long books or short books or anything like that, definitely let me know and I will try to make them. But again, thank you all so much for watching this video. If you'd like to follow me on any of my social media, all my links are in the description box as always. Thank you all so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed, and I will see you in my next video. Bye!